Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zu einer weiteren Folge von Im Auge des Bruders mit Scott Ritter hier auf unserem YouTube-Kanal Gegenpol. Mein Name ist Monique Stegemann und in dieser Woche geht es um folgende Themen. Erdogan auf Staatsbesuch bei Putin. Kann die Türkei im Ukraine-Krieg vermitteln? Ukraine entlässt Verteidigungsminister Resnikow. Ist die ukrainische Offensive gescheitert? Und welches Interesse haben die USA an den Militärputschen in Niger und Gabun? Hallo Scott, schön, dass du wieder die Zeit gefunden hast. Wie geht's dir?
Fine, thank you. Yourself?
Mir geht's sehr gut, Dankeschön. Scott, wir steigen direkt ins erste Thema ein, denn in der gemeinsamen Presseerklärung nach seinem Treffen mit dem russischen Präsidenten Wladimir Putin in Sotschi bot sich der türkische Präsident Recep Erdoğan als Vermittler im Ukraine-Krieg an. Fraglich ist aber, ob die Türkei von Russland überhaupt auf Augenhöhe betrachtet wird. Nach den jüngsten Konflikten wie der Freilassung von ukrainischen Asow-Kämpfern durch die Türkei hatten sich die Beziehungen ja zwischen Moskau und Ankara deutlich abgekühlt. Und auch das Treffen in Sotschi deutet nicht auf eine Entspannung hin. Putin soll laut Medienberichten Erdogan eine deutliche Abfuhr gegeben haben. Wie schätzt du die Rolle der Türkei im Ukraine-Konflikt ein? Erkennst du eine klare geopolitische Linie in der türkischen Außenpolitik? Oder laviert sie schlicht zwischen NATO-Westen einerseits und Russland, China und den BRICS andererseits?
Well, I think we need to look at a couple things. One, Russia and Turkey have a complicated relationship, but the relationship hinges on the necessity for both parties to avoid allowing that which divides them from overwhelming that which unites them. Russia and Turkey both have a mutual interest in pursuing relations that achieve regional stability and they're mutually beneficial economic relations. It's complicated by Turkey's ongoing occupation of Syria, which puts Turkey in direct conflict with Russian forces. In the past has led to violence. Turkey's posturing in Libya, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course, Turkey's ongoing support of Ukraine in this conflict. Turkey has provided Ukraine with weaponry and has made statements supportive of Ukraine's claims over Crimea. And this is all part of a package of Turkish behavior, inclusive of the release of Azov fighters who were detained, released to Turkey. They were supposed to be detained in Turkey until the end of conflict, but they've been released by Turkey to Ukraine. So, this is problematic, but we need to look at the history here. Turkey has, since this conflict began, played an important diplomatic role. If one goes back to the negotiations that took place in March of 2022, that could have led to a ceasefire agreement being signed in Istanbul, Turkey. Turkish mediators, including the personal role played by Recep Erdoğan, were critical in creating the potential of such an arrangement. Turkey was also essential for the Black Sea grain deal that was brokered, allowing Ukrainian grain and, in theory at least, Russian grain to be used to support world food programs, etc. So it's not unrealistic for Turkey to think that it could continue to play such a role. But the fact is, at this late stage in the game, Russia's not looking for a negotiated end to this conflict where a mediator like Turkey gives voice and credence to Ukraine. Russia's in the defeat Ukraine mode. They're not in the compromise with Ukraine mode. So there's very little role for Turkey to be playing here diplomatically, other than to put pressure on Ukraine to give in to Russian demands, because the Russian demands are inflexible and they aren't going to change. Russia's prevailing in this war. Ukraine is not. So it's unrealistic for Turkey to believe that it can reinsert itself and somehow replicate the posture that it enjoyed in March of 2022. The world has changed. Not only that, Turkey has sullied its reputation. I don't know if the Turks understand just how deeply offensive their release of the Azov fighters to Ukraine was in the minds of Russian politicians and the psyche of the Russian people. I think, in retrospect, will go down in the history of this conflict as one of Turkey's worst moves, because it totally delegitimized Turkey as an honest broker in the eyes of the Russians. And if Turkey were to try and reassert itself as a diplomatic moderator between Russia and Ukraine, it can't do so with this reputation. So that's done. Right now, we see Russia working with Turkey and Qatar to broker an alternative to the Black Sea grain initiative. This appears to be Russia's primary focus when it comes to working with the Turks. And Erdogan would probably do well to focus on something that enhances his stature as a reliable partner for Russia right now, because as things currently stand, he is not a reliable partner, and the Russians will not be treating him as such.
Blicken wir genauer auf die Ukraine. Dort hat nämlich Anfang der Woche das ukrainische Parlament den Verteidigungsminister Alexei Resnikow abgesetzt. Was ist hinter den Kulissen vorgefallen zwischen Präsident Wladimir Zelensky und Resnikow? Gibt es einen Zusammenhang mit dem Verlauf der ukrainischen Offensive? Und welche Rolle spielen die USA und die NATO bei der Entlassung Resnikows und der Einsetzung seines Nachfolgers Rustem Umerov?
Well, I mean, of course, the United States and NATO and the non-NATO European nations that comprise the collective West that is supporting Ukraine in this conflict have the ability to directly and indirectly pressure the Ukrainian government. Reznikov had become a liability on a number of fronts. He's a deeply corrupt individual, and the corruption that took place under his watch in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, corruption that he himself apparently was personally involved in, was such that it could not be swept under the rug anymore, especially given the fact that Reznikov had not produced the results that the West wanted. He was a very effective go-between with the West and Zelensky in terms of getting the West to provide equipment. He took the lead at the various gatherings of the Ramstein contact group, where the West was promising military assistance. Having received this, he wasn't able to translate the reception of this equipment into battlefield victory. And that failure, combined with his corruption, made it impossible for the West to continue to pour additional resources into Ukraine. More and more, I think we're going to be seeing the various constituents of the Western political officials who continue to support Ukraine start to question the wisdom of sending money to Ukraine when the results are so poor, especially as it was about to come out that the defense minister of Ukraine was such a highly corrupt individual. This could have a very negative impact on the ability of the collective West to continue their support for Ukraine. So the decision was made, I believe, to nip the problem in the bud, to get rid of him. He's not leaving in disgrace. He's being appointed as the ambassador to the United Kingdom, where he'll be able to continue his role of pressuring the United Kingdom and, by extension, the collective West into continuing to provide military support. And he'll be able to continue his corrupt practices because he is, of course, an insider. But his replacement is a Crimean Tatar who has a history of being a successful negotiator. He's somebody with a solid reputation of getting results that are favorable to the Ukrainian government. He has no military experience, but I think his role is to try and go in and clean up the mess that Reznikov made. There's another role too, given the high profile nature of this position. This is a Crimean Tatar, and the Zelensky government has made the return of Crimea to Ukraine one of their primary goals and objectives of this conflict. And so by appointing a Crimean Tatar as the new Minister of Defense for Ukraine, I think the Ukrainians are, making a political point that that they're going to continue that strategy, even if their military is currently unable to achieve that result on the battlefield.
Der russische Präsident Putin hat die ukrainische Offensive als gescheitert bezeichnet. Nach russischen Angaben soll die Ukraine bei der Offensive 66.000 Soldaten verloren haben. Jüngst ließ der ukrainische Mobilfunkanbieter Kyivstar durchblicken, dass 400.000 seiner männlichen Kunden keine Antwort mehr geben können. Was sagst du? Sind diese Zahlen authentisch? Wie schlimm steht es um die ukrainischen Verluste und wie lange kann die Ukraine angesichts dessen noch den Krieg gegen Russland fortsetzen?
Well, I think first of all we have to acknowledge that we simply don't know. There are no absolutely definitive sources for Ukrainian casualties. Ukrainian government itself has said that these figures are classified and considered state secrets. And one of the reasons was elaborated on by a Ukrainian official who said that we don't want to give the enemy an idea of where we stand in casualties because those numbers have an impact on, what we potentially can and can't do going forward in terms of this military campaign. So I think the implication of that statement is that the Ukrainian casualties are quite high and that they are having a negative impact on Ukraine's ability to continue this conflict, at least on the scope and scale that it's currently being waged. And it's, General Cavoli, who's the commander of American forces in Europe, has said that the level of violence taking place between Russia and Ukraine is something that NATO could never imagine. And I think people need to reflect on that this is the bloodiest conflict, the most lethal conflict since the Second World War, and in many cases probably even matches and exceeds that of the Second World War. Some of the casualty rates taking place are, remind people of World War I and the trench warfare that took place at that time on the Western Front and battles of Somme, etc. So, having said all that, I myself, when I'm asked to come up with casualty figures, I go through a rather elaborate algorithm in my mind that's derived from my past experience in war gaming, large-scale ground combat, especially assault breach operations of defensive positions, and my knowledge of weapon systems, probability of kill factors, and how terrain and weather, etc., impact that. It's imperfect, I understand that, but I've been tracking the fighting and have been coming up with numbers that are consistent with the 400,000 dead figure. Again, we won't know until the final statistics are put in, but it is a number in keeping with what appears to be the state of play on the battlefield in terms of the overall quality of the Ukrainian military. It appears they have lost the vast majority of their experienced officers and enlisted personnel that they possessed when this conflict began. They've even chewed through the newly mobilized, as in early 2022, who received more extensive training from the West. And they've now just gone through, again, if the Russian numbers are correct, somewhere in the order of 60 to 80,000 Ukrainian troops were trained by the West for this current offensive. And if Ukraine has gone through 66,000 of them, that pretty much means that Ukraine has eaten up its reservoir of trained manpower. And without trained manpower, without new sources of equipment, Ukraine can't continue the level of confrontation that's going on. And it appears that if these numbers are indeed accurate, that the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse. That once they've thrown in their strategic reserves into this final push near Robotyno, a village in Zaporizhia, it appears that this final push has been blunted by the Russians. There's nothing left for the Ukrainians to put in. They're talking about mobilizing young boys, old men, infirm, people with medical conditions that otherwise would make it impossible for them to fight. This is history. We've seen this before. We saw this in Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War, where the German government, the Nazis, mobilized the Volkssturm, going in and getting young boys and old men and people with disabilities, and shanghaiing them into combat units that had zero combat effectiveness on the battlefield. Indeed, the history of the Battle of Berlin shows that the professional German soldiers were begging the Nazi government not to put Volkssturm units in combat, because not only were they being slaughtered, but they were making overall German performance reduced, because they can't fight, and they would commit to a fight and not be able to sustain the fight, being defeated, putting the professionals in a more difficult position. This appears to be what the Ukrainian army is going through right now, the creation of the last gasp reserves, the Volkssturm, the old, the young, the feeble, with insufficient training, no knowledge of tactics, no knowledge of the equipment they're being called upon to use, being thrown into battle haphazardly against a Russian army that is very well trained, very well equipped, very lethal. If all of this analysis is accurate, I wouldn't be telling you this if I didn't believe it was accurate, then I believe that the Ukrainian army's days as an effective fighting force are numbered, and that we could be looking at the collapse of the Ukrainian army if this fighting continues on the pace that it currently is, to occur sometime by the end of this summer or early fall.
Was wird passieren, wenn die Ukraine nicht mehr in der Lage ist, ihre Offensive fortzusetzen? Westliche Medien berichten bereits, dass es Vorbereitung für eine mögliche russische Offensive gibt. Wie siehst du das, Scott? Wird Russland eine groß angelegte Offensive starten?
Again, war is an extension of politics by other means, and how Russia brings it into this conflict is a political question that only the Russian government can answer. Going over to a large-scale offensive is not beyond the capability of the Russian military. The question is how this would happen, where it would happen, and what would the scale of this offensive be. Russia has been fairly casualty averse, meaning that they engage in tactics and operational methodologies on the ground that are designed to maximize Ukrainian casualties, minimize Russian casualties. For Russia to transition over into the offensive means that Russia will be assuming greater risk, and that its forces could suffer higher casualties. That's a political question that needs to be, it can only be answered by the Russian government. To what casualty figure? I mean, as a military guy, I can draw maps on arrows on a map as good as anybody else. You don't need to be a military genius to look at a map, look at force dispositions, and look at terrain, look at lines of communication, and say that if Russia did A, B, and C, they could put the Ukrainians in a very difficult position militarily. The problem is that A, B, and C all entail operations that, if the Ukrainians offer even a modicum of resistance, could lead to high Russian casualties. Does the Russian government want to incur those casualties? And if they don't, then the Russian government would, probably take a slower pace in terms of this operation. So the military professionals will be guided by the political guidance given to them by the Russians. I do believe that the Ukrainian army will suffer some sort of precipitous collapse that the Russians will be able to exploit, and that this could lead, depending on the scope and scale of the collapse, it could lead to Russia pushing the Ukrainian army back beyond the Dnieper River. But at that point in time, what Russia does next, again, is a political question. Does Russia want to commit to a military assault on Odessa? Does Russia want to commit to building a land bridge or Transnistria. All of these have geopolitical consequences that could impact Ukraine's willingness or readiness or ability to bring about an end to this conflict. I think it's in Russia's interest to have this conflict end sooner rather than later, so long as compromises aren't made. But if you take a look at the end of the Second World War, some of the bloodiest battles that were fought by the Red Army took place in the final weeks of the Second World War. The assault on Berlin, the battle for Vienna, for Prague. This was a defeated German army. Everybody knew the German army was defeated. It could not win, but it was still lethal. It could inflict harm, and it did inflict harm on the Soviet forces. And nobody should be of any mind that the Ukrainian army, even in defeat, will not continue to be a lethal force capable of inflicting harm on Russian troops. So I think that you're going to see, at least I would anticipate, that the Russians will be far more restrained than many people may expect. But it appears that they do have sufficient reserves, up to 200,000, maybe even more, trained, equipped, prepared to be committed to this battle at a time and place of Russia's choosing.
Schauen wir nach Afrika. Während der Putsch in Niger von westlichen Medien und Politikern verdammt und der Putschregierung mit Krieg gedroht wurde, wurde der Putsch in Gabun leichten Herzens akzeptiert. Der EU-Außenbeauftragte Josep Borrell äußert Verständnis für die Absetzung einer illegitimen Regierung. Das Staatsmedium Deutsche Welle spricht von einem Putsch der Gerechtigkeit. Woher kommt diese unterschiedliche Sichtweise auf Niger und Gabun? Warum wird der Militärregierung Niger mit Krieg gedroht, während die Machtübernahme von General Brice Oligui Nguema in Gabun sogar begrüßt wird?
I think even the French have been uncomfortable with the level of corruption in the government of Gabon over the past several years, and the most recent election results, which appear to have been corrupted by government influence, that sustained the presidency of a man who was the son of a former corrupt president who was brought into power by a French-backed military coup back in the 60s. Even the French were uncomfortable by the level of corruption that existed here. And so when one takes a look at the general who took over in Gabon, you see he's not somebody who is virulently anti-French. He is somebody who has a good relationship with the French, with the Americans, with the West. So I think they're comfortable with this man, and they're sort of relieved that that corruption of the ousted government no longer continues. And I also think that they're taking guidance off of the failure of their confrontational stance in Niger. It hasn't succeeded in reversing the coup. It's only strengthened the coup forces and created a bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and now Niger together, which are opposed to any intervention. So I think that a combination of factors have led the West to take a relatively low-key approach to the Gabon affair, hoping that they can emerge with their economic and geopolitical interests intact, as opposed to what's going on in Niger, where we've seen the Niger government, talk about the eviction of the French ambassador, the eviction of French troops. Basically, France is going to be kicked out of Niger. I don't think France wants to be kicked out of Gabon.
Unsere Zuschauer haben die Frage gestellt, welchen Einfluss die USA bei den Militärputschen in Niger hatten. Wurde in Niger womöglich eine frankophile Regierung gestürzt, um eine mit den USA verbundene zu installieren? So fordert die nigrische Regierung den Abzug der französischen Truppen, aber nicht der US-amerikanischen. Bricht Niger wirklich mit dem Westen oder nur mit Frankreich?
The U.S. has taken a very low-key approach to this conflict. They did send Victoria Nuland in a very high-profile intervention. The intervention did not have the desired results, but since that time, the United States has not been vocal in first of all, calling a coup a coup. They continue to play word games, semantic games there, because there's legal implications to that I think France has been somewhat disappointed by the American reaction. I think France was hopeful that the Americans would be much more vocal in their support of the French position, but it appears that the United States is not willing to lose access to the two bases that it has built at great expense. The base 201 in central Niger in the Sahel, in the Saharan desert, cost over $100 million to build, and it's considered to be the foundational base of America's military presence in West Africa, in the Sahel, to fight terrorism. And so the United States does not want to lose access to this base, because to lose access to that base means they lose access to the region. And so the United States is taking a much more hands-off approach. Was the United States behind the coup? There's no evidence to show that. One can speculate, given the difference between the American stance and the French stance. Even though the United States and France are allies in Europe, they're not allies in Africa. They are on paper, but France has a very aggressive neo-colonial posture that runs counter to the principles of the United States in terms of self-determination and things of that nature. And the continued economic exploitation, the political domination, and the social disparity. The people of Niger are extraordinarily poor and poverty-stricken in a nation that produces so many resources that should enrich this nation. And the United States has a base there. The soldiers, sailors, airmen who operate at that base have eyes. Those eyes are connected to a brain that's connected to a body that writes reports. And I believe, a lot of these people are writing back saying that, the French presence in Niger, the French presence in West Africa is poisonous. And that maybe the best thing to do would be to get the French out of the picture and let us in America go forward unimpeded by French, the wreckage of France's colonial experience. So this is all speculation on my part. The person asked a question. I'm trying to do my best to give an answer. I don't think the United States was involved directly in this coup. But I also believe that the United States, because it hasn't vocally come out in support of France, is doing its best to distance itself from France so that it can continue to have a presence in Niger going forward.
Auf den Punkt gefragt, begrüßen die USA eine Verdrängung Frankreichs aus dessen früheren Kolonien in Afrika? Haben die USA ein Interesse an einer Deindustrialisierung und somit Schwächung Frankreichs und Deutschlands? Und welche geopolitische Strategie steckt dahinter?
There's a lot of conspiracy theory type elements to that question. Look, there's people smarter than me everywhere, and especially in the field of economics, who have postulated that given the ongoing de-dollarization, it's in the interest of the United States to create a Europe that is dependent upon the dollar. And one of the best ways to ensure that Europe stays in the under the umbrella of dollar dominance is to weaken the euro and the Eurozone and the European Union, et cetera. And I mean, you can point to things such as our insistence that Germany divorce itself from Russian energy. It's been disastrous for Germany. The economic impact of this has devastated Germany. There's ongoing deindustrialization as we speak. The American political domination of German politicians, to have German politicians undertake policies that are clearly against the interests of the German people, and yet they do it anyways, implies that this is a directed effort by the United States. And there's not a rational human being that can articulate why what's going on in Germany is good for Germany. It's not good for Germany. It weakens Germany. And yet that seems to be the policy that the United States is pushing on Germany. And so these conspiracy theories of an American effort to deindustrialize Europe suddenly can't be dismissed. I don't have proof that that's indeed what the United States is doing. And it runs counter to our public stance of being close friends with Germany. Now we take a look at France. We have the same, France is paying a heavy price in terms of energy because of the high prices that have resulted from, taking Russian energy off the European market. At least officially, we know that behind the scenes, many European countries continue to buy Russian energy, but that's another issue altogether. But when you take a look at, the French, the role played by France-Afrique, that is the former colonial possessions of France in Africa, which even when France withdrew from Africa, they maintained a neo-colonial domination over them through currency controls, economic domination, political domination, social domination. This was extraordinarily beneficial to France. To give you an example, while the Niger and Africa, they provide, I think, somewhere in the area of between 20 and 30% of the uranium used in the French nuclear power infrastructure enterprise. And France, of course, procures uranium from other sources. France doesn't procure uranium from other sources at the cost that it gets out of Niger. I think the recent statistics show that Niger was selling uranium to France at 80 cents, that's European cents, to the kilo. Whereas other nations are selling it to France at 200 euro to the kilo. And Niger has just said, well, we're going to start selling at 200 euros to the kilo too. But this is the kind of economic exploitation that France was doing throughout Africa that helped prop up the French economy. And one would think that if the United States were not stupid, we know how the French economy works. We've already embarked on policies that have destroyed the French economy, helped promote deindustrialization in the French economy because of high energy costs. And now we're engaged in policies which appear to promote the withdrawal of France from France-Afrique, which will bring about a whole new restructuring of the African economy and geopolitical reality to the detriment of France. We know this, and yet that's the policy we seem to be doing, which then lends itself to a conclusion that says it's the goal of the United States to destroy European economy in an effort to destroy the euro so that the dollar will emerge as the dominant currency in Europe. And this will give the United States, some sort of continued relevance in the global economic system as de-dollarization occurs elsewhere. It's a theory. Can I sit here and tell you that that's exactly what's happening? No, I can't tell you that. It's a theory that's logical, but I think we have to wait and see, what the tea leaves tell us going forward.
Vielen Dank, Scott, wie immer, für deine Zeit und deine aufschlussreichen Analysen. Dankeschön. Bis nächste Woche.
Okay, you're welcome.
Meine lieben Zuschauer, auch an euch herzlichen Dank fürs Zusehen. Wenn euch die Sendung gefallen hat, dann teilt doch unser Video bitte breit in den sozialen Medien, abonniert eben noch unseren Kanal Gegenpol und vor allem, falls ihr mal Fragen habt, die wir unbedingt Scott Ritter stellen sollen, dann schreibt sie uns doch in die Kommentare. Bis dahin, eure Monique.